George Strait finds employee, humiliated by millionaire. What George does will impact you. The fluorescent lights of the small apartment flickered as Rose Matthews stared at the stack of medical bills spread across her kitchen table. It was 3 in the morning, and she had exactly 2 hours before her alarm would ring, signaling the start of another exhausting day. Her fingers traced the bold red letters, stamping the top invoice, final notice. The amount due made her stomach turn. $12,000 for her youngest son's latest round of cardiac tests and medications. She pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the worn linoleum floor, and walked quietly down the narrow hallway. Standing in the doorway of the boys' bedroom, she watched them sleep. Tommy, her oldest at 15, sprawled across his twin bed with his basketball still clutched in one hand. He had asked her 3 times that week if he could try out for the school team, but the registration fee of $75 might as well have been $75,000. Then there was little Marcus, only 8 years old, his small chest rising and falling with each breath, the soft wheeze barely audible but always present, always reminding her of the ticking clock they lived with every single day. The doctors at Vanderbilt Medical Center had been clear during their last appointment. Marcus needed a specialized procedure within the next 6 months, or his condition would deteriorate rapidly. The surgery itself cost $60,000, and their basic insurance covered less than half. Rose had already picked up every extra shift available at the Southern Charm restaurant, worked double shifts until her feet bled inside her shoes, and still the mountain of debt only seemed to grow taller. She returned to the kitchen and poured herself a cup of yesterday's reheated coffee, bitter and cold, but it was all she had. The refrigerator hummed loudly, a sound that had become increasingly concerning over the past few weeks. If it died, she had no idea how she would replace it. Every dollar was already spoken for, allocated to some desperate need or another. The rent was due in 5 days. Marcus needed his medication refilled. Tommy had outgrown his only pair of school shoes 3 months ago, and he had been wearing them anyway, never complaining, never asking for anything because he understood, even at 15, that his mother was drowning. Rose had worked at the Southern Charm for 17 years, ever since she was 21 years old, and fresh from a disastrous marriage that had left her alone and pregnant. She had started as a hostess, moved up to server, and had been promised the supervisor position at least a dozen times over the years. Each time, management had given the promotion to someone else, someone younger, someone who could work even more hours, someone who didn't have to rush home to sick children and parent-teacher conferences. But Rose never complained. She showed up early, stayed late, smiled at every customer no matter how rude they were, and built a reputation as the most reliable employee in the entire establishment. The restaurant itself sat in the heart of downtown Nashville, right on Broadway, where tourists and music industry executives mingled every night under the glow of neon signs and the sound of live country music pouring from every doorway. Southern Charm had earned its reputation as the place where deals were made, where contracts were signed over expensive steaks and aged whiskey, where the who's who of country music came to see and be seen. Rose had served them all over the years, rising stars, fading legends, producers, managers, label executives. She had learned to be invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to never interrupt, never intrude, but always be there exactly when needed. Tonight would be no different, she told herself, as she finally crawled into bed for 90 minutes of restless sleep. The restaurant had a major event scheduled, some big celebration for a record deal that her manager had been fussing about all week. Extra staff had been called in, the menu had been revised 4 times, and the wine cellar had been restocked with bottles that cost more than Rose's monthly rent. She would put on her black slacks, her white button-down shirt, her non-slip shoes that desperately needed replacing, and she would smile. She would serve. She would be invisible. And maybe, just maybe, the tips would be good enough to buy Marcus his medicine and put something aside for that looming surgery bill. If you are watching this story unfold and feeling the weight of Rose's struggle, we would love to hear from you. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know where you are watching from. Your support means the world to us, and we read every single comment. Now, let us continue with Rose's story, because what happens next will change everything. The alarm screamed at 5 in the morning, but Rose was already awake, staring at the ceiling and running through her mental checklist. Get the boys up, make breakfast with whatever was left in the pantry, pack Tommy's lunch, give Marcus his morning medications, drop Marcus at her neighbor Mrs. Chen's apartment, where the kind elderly woman watched him after school for a fraction of what daycare would cost, take 2 buses to reach the restaurant by noon for the pre-event setup, work until midnight or later, take 2 buses home, sleep for a few hours, repeat. Tommy emerged from the bedroom rubbing his eyes, already dressed in his too small jeans and faded t-shirt. He had inherited his father's height and was now taller than Rose by 3 inches, though he still had that boyish face that made her heart ache. He had grown up too fast, taking on responsibilities that no teenager should have to carry. He helped with Marcus, picked up groceries when Rose gave him money, and never once complained about wearing clothes from the thrift store or eating rice and beans 4 nights a week. "Morning, Mom," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "I can make breakfast, you go get ready." "You sure, baby?" Rose asked, though she was already moving toward the bathroom. Time was always her enemy. "I got it. Eggs and toast for Marcus, right? With his medicine crushed up in the eggs so he doesn't taste it." She paused in the doorway and looked at her son, this beautiful boy who had learned to be a man before his time. "What did I do to deserve you?" Tommy smiled, that crooked grin that could still light up her darkest days. "You showed up, Mom. Every single day you show up. That's more than a lot of kids get." The words hit her harder than he probably intended. She blinked back tears and nodded, disappearing into the bathroom before he could see her face crumble. The shower was lukewarm at best, the hot water heater another appliance living on borrowed time, but she scrubbed quickly and efficiently. There was no time for luxury, no time for the long, hot showers she sometimes fantasized about. She dried her hair with a towel, pulled it back into a tight bun, and applied the minimal makeup she could afford. Drugstore foundation to hide the exhaustion, a swipe of mascara to make her look more awake than she felt. When she emerged, Tommy had somehow managed to make the tiny apartment smell like a real breakfast. Marcus sat at the table, his small legs swinging back and forth, a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. He looked up when Rose entered, and his whole face lit up with that smile that made everything worthwhile. "Mommy, Tommy made eggs. They're really good." "I bet they are, sweetheart. Make sure you eat it all, okay? You need your strength." Marcus nodded enthusiastically and dug into his breakfast. Rose watched him eat, noting the slight blue tinge to his lips that had been getting more pronounced lately. She had mentioned it to the doctor at their last visit, and he had given her that look, the one that said time was running out, the one that said they needed to move faster on the surgery plans. But how could she move faster when she was already sprinting and still falling behind? The morning routine played out like a well-rehearsed dance. Rose packed Tommy's lunch with the last of the bread and peanut butter, counted out Marcus's afternoon pills into a small container for Mrs. Chen, and gathered her own things for the long day ahead. Her work shoes sat by the door and she stared at them for a moment. The sole on the right one had started to separate, and she had been gluing it back together every few days. She needed new shoes. She needed so many things. But needs were a luxury she couldn't afford, not when Marcus's life hung in the balance. By 6:30, they were out the door, beginning the complicated journey that was their daily routine. 2 buses to get Marcus to Mrs. Chen's apartment across town, where the elderly woman was already waiting at her door with a warm smile and a plate of homemade cookies that Marcus would devour the moment Rose left. Then back on the bus, this time heading downtown, watching the city wake up around her. Nashville in the early morning was a different creature than Nashville at night. The tourists were still sleeping off their hangovers, and the streets belonged to the workers, the people like Rose who made the city function behind the scenes. She arrived at the Southern Charm at 11:30, half an hour early as always. The restaurant wouldn't open until 5, but there was prep work to be done, tables to be set, silverware to be polished. The manager, a stern woman named Patricia who had never smiled in the 17 years Rose had known her, was already barking orders when Rose walked through the employee entrance. "Matthews, good, you're here. We have a full house tonight, and I mean full. Every table is reserved, and we have the entire back section blocked off for the Holloway party. You'll be assigned to that section along with Jennifer and Mike. These are VIP guests, which means you need to be perfect. No mistakes. No spills, no idle chatter. Just efficient professional service, understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Rose replied automatically. Her mind was already shifting into work mode, pushing aside thoughts of medical bills and broken refrigerators and shoes held together with superglue. For the next 12 hours, she would be perfect. She had no other choice. The afternoon passed in a blur of preparation. The kitchen staff worked frantically, preparing elaborate dishes that Rose knew cost more per plate than she spent on groceries in a month. The bar was stocked with premium liquors, wines that required special handling, champagne that needed to be kept at exact temperatures. The back section was transformed into something that looked more like a luxury lounge than a restaurant dining area, with special lighting, floral arrangements that must have cost thousands of dollars, and place settings that probably required insurance. Jennifer, a younger server who had been at the restaurant for only 3 years, came up beside Rose as they were folding napkins into elaborate designs. "Have you heard about this Holloway guy? Apparently he just closed some massive deal with that new country singer, you know, the one who won that TV competition. Word is the contract is worth millions, and he's celebrating by dropping serious money tonight." Rose shook her head. "I don't follow the industry drama, I just serve the food and collect my tips." "Well, apparently this guy is known for being difficult. Super demanding, throws tantrums if things aren't exactly right, but tips really well if you can handle his attitude. Patricia specifically assigned you to his table because you never lose your cool." The information settled in Rose's stomach like a stone. Difficult customers weren't new to her, but on nights when exhaustion sat on her shoulders like a physical weight, when her mind kept wandering to Marcus and those medical bills and the ticking clock of his deteriorating health, maintaining her professional mask required every ounce of strength she had. But she would do it. She always did. By 5 o'clock, the restaurant had transformed. Music played softly through hidden speakers, some classic country song that Rose recognized but couldn't name. The lighting had been adjusted to create an intimate, sophisticated atmosphere, and the guests began to arrive, dressed in designer clothes and expensive jewelry, laughing and chattering, their voices filled with the careless confidence of people who had never worried about keeping the lights on or choosing between medicine and food. The Holloway party arrived at 7:30, with an entourage that seemed to fill the entire back section of the restaurant. Blake Holloway himself was unmistakable, even though Rose had never seen him before. He walked with the swagger of someone who believed the world existed solely for his entertainment. His suit probably cost more than Rose made in 6 months, a crisp white blazer over black slacks, with a silk shirt unbuttoned just enough to show off a gold chain that caught the light with every movement. His watch was the kind that appeared in magazine advertisements, the kind that screamed wealth and status. His hair was slicked back with too much product, and his smile was wide but never reached his eyes. He was surrounded by at least a dozen people, all dressed similarly expensive, all laughing a bit too loud at his jokes, all vying for his attention like moths around a flame. Rose recognized the dynamic immediately. She had seen it 1,000 times in this restaurant. One person with power, everyone else desperately trying to stay in their orbit, hoping some of that power and money would rub off on them. Patricia appeared at Rose's elbow, her voice low and urgent. "That's him. Holloway. He just ordered 4 bottles of the Chateau Margaux. Do you know how much those cost? $800 each, so you need to handle them like they're liquid gold, because they basically are. I want you on his table personally. Jennifer and Mike can handle the rest of his party, but you take care of Holloway himself. And Rose, I mean it. Perfect service. This could be a huge night for tips." Rose nodded, her professional mask firmly in place. She had opened expensive bottles of wine before, had served powerful people before, had dealt with demanding customers before. This would be no different. She picked up her serving tray and made her way to the bar where the sommelier was already carefully decanting the first bottle, treating it with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. As she approached the table, Rose took a moment to observe the scene. Holloway sat at the head of the long table like a king holding court. He was in the middle of a story, his hands gesturing wildly, and everyone hung on his every word. The story seemed to be about how he had convinced some young artist to sign with him instead of a competing producer, and the way he told it made him sound like a genius strategist rather than what he probably was, just another person with money and connections. "Excuse me, Mr. Holloway," Rose said quietly, approaching from his left side as she had been trained. "Never interrupt from the front, never startle a guest, always give them space to acknowledge you first. I have your first bottle of wine. Would you like to taste it before I pour for the table?" Holloway turned to look at her, his eyes sweeping over her in a way that made her skin crawl. It was the look she had learned to ignore over the years, the look that reduced her to something less than human, Just part of the furniture. Just another service to be used. Yeah, sure. Pour me a taste. Rose performed the ritual with practiced precision. She showed him the label, waited for his nod of approval, then poured exactly 3 ounces into his glass. He picked it up, swirled it dramatically, stuck his nose deep into the glass, and took a sip. The whole performance took nearly a minute while Rose stood there waiting, holding the heavy bottle at exactly the right angle. "It's acceptable," he finally pronounced, as if he were doing her a favor. "You can pour for everyone." Rose moved around the table, filling glasses with exact precision. Too much and it looked sloppy. Too little and guests felt cheated. She had learned the perfect pour through years of practice, and her hands moved with automatic efficiency. She was on the 3rd glass when Holloway's voice cut through the background noise. "So I told him, I said, listen, kid, you can either sign with me and be a star, or you can sign with Warner and be another nobody in their roster." And you know what he did? He signed right there, didn't even read the contract. That's the kind of trust I inspire in people. That's the kind of reputation I've built. One of the women at the table, a blonde in a dress that probably cost more than Marcus's surgery, laughed and touched Holloway's arm. "You're just so good at what you do, Blake. It's like you have a 6th sense for talent." "Damn right I do. And I know how to close a deal. That's why I'm sitting here celebrating an 8-figure contract while my competitors are sitting in their offices, wondering where they went wrong." Rose continued pouring, making herself invisible as she had learned to do. These people didn't want to acknowledge her existence beyond her function. She was a servant, there to facilitate their celebration, not to be noticed or considered. She had made peace with that a long time ago. Dignity didn't pay medical bills. The evening progressed in the typical rhythm of a busy night at Southern Charm. Rose moved between the kitchen and the dining room, delivering appetizers, refilling water glasses, opening more bottles of that expensive wine. The Holloway party grew louder with each course, their laughter more boisterous, their stories more exaggerated. Holloway himself seemed to grow more expansive with each glass of wine, his voice carrying across the entire back section, his gestures becoming more dramatic. At one point, Rose caught a glimpse of another customer in the main dining room, a man sitting alone at a corner table. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, a Stetson cowboy hat resting on the chair beside him. There was something familiar about him, but she couldn't quite place it in the chaos of the busy night. He was reading a menu, seemingly content with his own company, a stark contrast to the loud celebration happening in the back section. By 9 o'clock, Rose's feet were screaming. The separation in her right shoe had gotten worse, and she could feel the floor through the gap with every step. Her lower back ached from carrying heavy trays, and she had developed a headache that pulsed behind her eyes, but she kept moving, kept smiling, kept performing her role with the precision that had made her Patricia's go-to server for difficult customers. The main courses were served without incident. Holloway had ordered the most expensive steak on the menu, prepared rare, with sides that required 3 separate plates. He complained that the temperature wasn't quite right, sent it back, then complained again when it returned exactly as he had originally requested. Rose apologized both times, her voice steady and professional, even though she wanted to tell him that his petty complaints were nothing compared to watching your child struggle to breathe at night. It was during the dessert course that everything changed. Rose was bringing out the final bottle of wine, the 4th Chateau Margaux, when Jennifer rushed past her carrying a tray of elaborate chocolate soufflés. Jennifer's hip bumped Rose's elbow, just a slight collision in the narrow space between tables, but it was enough. The bottle tilted in Rose's hands, and she grabbed for it, trying to steady it, her heart suddenly racing. She managed to keep hold of it, managed to keep it from dropping, but a few drops, maybe 4 or 5, splashed from the neck of the bottle. Time seemed to slow down. Rose watched those drops arc through the air, dark red against the warm lighting of the restaurant, and land with tiny splashes on the pristine white sleeve of Blake Holloway's blazer. They spread slowly, staining the expensive fabric, impossibly visible against that pure white. The conversation at the table died instantly. Everyone stared at the small red stains. Rose felt her stomach drop, felt her hand start to shake. This was exactly what Patricia had warned her about. No mistakes, no spills, perfect service. "I am so sorry, Mr. Holloway," she said immediately, setting the bottle down on the table with trembling hands. "Please, let me help you clean that. I'll get some club soda right away, and we'll take care of the dry cleaning cost, of course." For a moment, Holloway just stared at his sleeve, his face unreadable. Then slowly, very slowly, he turned to look at her. His expression was cold, calculating, and Rose felt ice water flow through her veins. She had seen that look before, the look of someone who was about to make someone else pay for a mistake, someone who enjoyed having power over others. "Do you have any idea," he said, his voice quiet but somehow more threatening than if he had yelled, "how much this blazer cost?" "I'm very sorry, sir. We'll absolutely cover the cleaning cost and—" "Cleaning cost?" He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made everyone in the restaurant turn to look. "You think dry cleaning is going to fix this? This is a custom Brioni blazer. Do you even know what that means?" "Of course you don't. How could you? This blazer cost $12,000. $12,000. That's more than you probably make in a year serving tables to your betters." Rose felt her face burn with humiliation. Everyone was staring now, not just his table, but the entire restaurant. She could see Patricia rushing over from the hostess stand, her face pale with panic. The kitchen staff had stopped what they were doing and stood in the doorway watching. Even the man in the corner, the one with the cowboy hat, had looked up from his meal. "Sir, I promise you we will make this right. I am so very sorry. It was completely my fault, and I take full responsibility." Rose's voice was shaking now, and she hated herself for it. Hated showing weakness, but the fear was overwhelming. She couldn't lose this job. She couldn't. Marcus needed his medicine, the surgery, the bills. Everything depended on this job. Holloway took a step closer to her, and Rose instinctively took a step back. His face was flushed now, whether from the wine or from anger. She couldn't tell. "Your fault? Of course it's your fault. People like you, people who serve tables for a living, you're careless. You don't understand the value of things. You don't understand what it means to own something worth more than your entire pathetic life." One of the women at the table, the blonde who had been hanging on his every word earlier, touched his arm tentatively. "Blake, honey, maybe we should just—" "Don't tell me to calm down," he snapped at her, and she withdrew her hand quickly, looking embarrassed. He turned back to Rose, and his voice got louder. "You know what? I'm going to make sure you lose your job over this. In fact, I guarantee it. Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea how much influence I have in this town? I could make one phone call and ensure you never work in any decent establishment in Nashville again." Tears were streaming down Rose's face now, and she didn't care anymore about maintaining her professional composure. "Please, sir, please don't do that. This job, it's all I have. I have 2 children, and my youngest son is sick. He needs medical treatment, and I'm the only one who can provide for them. Please, I'm begging you. I'll pay for the blazer myself. However long it takes, I'll pay for it. Just please don't cost me my job." The desperation in her voice seemed to fuel something dark in Holloway. He smiled, but it was a cruel smile, the smile of someone who enjoyed watching others suffer. "Oh, you'll pay for it all right. In fact, let's do that right now. $12,000. I want it in cash right now, or I'm calling your manager over here and demanding your termination immediately." "I don't have that kind of money," Rose whispered. "I can barely afford—" "Not my problem. You damaged my property. You pay for it. That's how the world works. Actions have consequences, especially for people like you who can't afford to make mistakes. Maybe this will teach you to be more careful in the future. Although given that you're about to be unemployed, I suppose it won't matter much." Patricia had finally reached the table, her face a mask of professional concern that barely hid her panic. "Mr. Holloway, I am so sorry about this incident. Please, allow me to handle this situation. We will absolutely cover any costs associated with—" "I don't want your corporate handling of the situation," Holloway interrupted. "I want her to understand that her carelessness has consequences. I want everyone in this restaurant to understand that when you serve people who are actually important, people who actually matter in this world, you need to be more careful." Rose was crying openly now, her professional mask completely shattered. She thought about Marcus, about those medical bills, about the surgery he needed in 6 months. She thought about Tommy and his 2 small shoes and how he never complained. She thought about the stack of final notices on her kitchen table. She thought about how she had worked 17 years at this restaurant, never complained, always showed up, always did her best, and how it was all about to come crashing down because of a few drops of wine. And then, cutting through her despair, cutting through Holloway's continued tirade, came a voice. It was calm, measured, with a slight Texas drawl, and it carried an authority that made everyone in the restaurant go silent. Excuse me, friend. I couldn't help but notice there seems to be some kind of problem here. Rose looked up through her tears to see the man from the corner table. He had put on his Stetson hat and was walking toward them with an easy, confident stride. He was older, maybe in his early 70s, with silver hair and weathered features that spoke of years spent outdoors. There was something about his presence, something that commanded respect without demanding it, something that made even Blake Holloway pause in his verbal assault. And then Rose recognized him. Her breath caught in her throat. George Strait, the king of country, the living legend who had more #1 hits than any artist in any genre, the man who had been singing about Texas and love and honor for over 40 years. He was standing right there in the Southern Charm, and he was walking toward them. Holloway recognized him too, and for the first time that evening, he seemed uncertain. "Mr. Strait, I didn't realize you were here. This is just a small matter, nothing that should concern you." George stopped a few feet from their table and looked at the scene with those calm, assessing eyes. He looked at Rose's tear-stained face, at the small wine stains on Holloway's sleeve, at the crowd of people watching with rapt attention. Then he looked back at Holloway, and when he spoke, his voice was still calm, still measured, but there was steel underneath it. "Well, from where I was sitting, it looked like a whole lot more than a small matter. It looked like someone was forgetting the basic principles of human decency. And that, friend, is something I can't just sit by and watch." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching now, watching to see what would happen next, watching to see what the king of country would do when confronted with the ugly reality of power and cruelty. Rose stood there, frozen, her tears still falling, unable to believe that this was actually happening, that George Strait himself was intervening on her behalf. Holloway's face had turned an interesting shade of red, a mixture of embarrassment and anger at being challenged in front of his guests, in front of everyone. "With all due respect, Mr. Strait, this really isn't your concern. This woman damaged my property through her carelessness, and I'm simply ensuring there are appropriate consequences." George tilted his head slightly, and a small smile played at the corners of his mouth, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Appropriate consequences. That's an interesting way to put it. Tell me something, friend. Have you ever made a mistake in your life? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Holloway's mouth opened and closed, clearly not expecting to be questioned by anyone, let alone by George Strait. The blonde woman at his table had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. The other guests looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. Patricia stood frozen near the kitchen door, probably calculating how this situation could possibly be salvaged. "Of course I've made mistakes," Holloway finally said, his voice defensive. "Everyone makes mistakes. But when you make mistakes that cost other people money, you need to pay for them. That's just basic responsibility." George nodded slowly, as if considering this point. He took a step closer, and Rose noticed he moved with the slight stiffness of someone who had spent years performing on stage, years of physical wear and tear, but there was still strength in his posture, still that cowboy confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were. Basic responsibility, I like that. So let me ask you another question. When you make mistakes in your business, and I know you must make them because everyone does, do your artists get to humiliate you in public? Do they get to threaten your livelihood? Do they get to make you cry in front of a room full of strangers? "That's completely different," Holloway protested. "I'm a producer. I'm in a position of power." George finished for him. "Is that what you were going to say? You're in a position of power, so different rules apply to you. See, that's where you and I differ, friend. I was raised to believe that having power means you have more responsibility to treat people right, not less." Rose watched this exchange feeling like she was in a dream. George Strait was defending her. George Strait, who had sung at stadiums and arenas around the world, who had sold millions of records, who was royalty in the country music world, was standing up for a struggling waitress from Nashville. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but her voice seemed to have abandoned her entirely. Holloway's face had gone from red to almost purple. "Mr. Strait, I appreciate your perspective, but you don't understand the situation. This blazer is custom-made. It's irreplaceable, and she ruined it through sheer carelessness. I have every right to expect compensation." "Oh, I understand the situation just fine," George said, and now his voice had an edge to it that made several people at the table flinch. "I understand that a hard-working woman had a small accident while serving you expensive wine that she probably can't afford to drink herself. I understand that instead of accepting a gracious apology, and moving on with your evening, you decided to use your position to humiliate and threaten her. I understand that you're the kind of man who measures his worth by the cost of his clothing and enjoys making other people feel small. Yeah, I understand just fine. One of the men at Holloway's table, someone Rose hadn't really noticed before, cleared his throat nervously. Blake, maybe we should just let it go. It's just a few drops of wine. The blazer can be cleaned. Holloway spun on him with fury in his eyes. Stay out of this, Marcus. This is between me and me, George interrupted calmly, because I'm making it my business. Now, I've been sitting over there enjoying a quiet meal, and I've been listening to you hold court all evening. I've heard you talk about your deals, your contracts, your influence. I've heard you tell stories about yourself like you're some kind of king. And you know what? I didn't say anything because everyone's entitled to enjoy their evening however they want. But this, he gestured to Rose, who was still standing there trembling. This crosses a line that I can't ignore. Patricia finally found her voice. Mr. Strait, please let me handle this situation. We have protocols for... George held up a hand, polite but firm. Ma'am, I'm sure you do. But right now, I think this needs to be handled a different way. He turned back to Holloway. You said the blazer cost $12,000. Yes, Holloway said, seeming to sense a victory. Custom made in Italy, one of a kind. And you want her to pay for it right now in cash? That's what I said. Actions have consequences. George nodded slowly. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a wallet, a simple brown leather wallet that looked like it had been carried for years. He opened it, pulled out a credit card, and held it out to Patricia. Ma'am, would you mind running this for $12,000? Put it on my bill. The restaurant erupted in gasps and whispers. Rose felt her knees go weak. $12,000. He was going to pay $12,000 for her mistake. It was incomprehensible. It was impossible. It was more money than she could wrap her mind around someone spending so casually. That's not necessary, Holloway said quickly, and Rose could hear the calculation in his voice. He had just realized who he was dealing with, and the implications of having George Strait pay for his damaged blazer were sinking in. Really, Mr. Strait, I don't expect you to... Oh, but I insist, George said, and his smile was sharp now. You said she needed to pay for it, and since she clearly doesn't have that kind of money, I'm paying on her behalf. Unless you're saying the blazer isn't actually worth $12,000, unless maybe you were exaggerating to make yourself feel important. Holloway's mouth opened and closed like a fish. No, it's definitely worth that, but I mean, if you're willing to cover it, then maybe we can just forget the whole thing. Forget it? George's eyebrows rose. Now that's interesting. A minute ago you were demanding consequences, threatening this woman's job, talking about your influence and power. But now that someone's actually willing to pay your price, suddenly you want to forget it. That doesn't seem very consistent, friend. The blonde woman at the table spoke up, her voice nervous. Blake, maybe we should just accept Mr. Strait's generous offer and move on. It's getting late and I don't need anyone to pay for anything, Holloway said, his voice tight. I was making a point about responsibility and respect. Were you? George asked. Because from where I was sitting, it looked more like you were enjoying making someone cry. It looked like you were using your money and position to bully someone who couldn't fight back. And you know what we call that where I come from in Texas? We call that being a coward. The word hung in the air like a slap. Several people at the table gasped. Holloway's face went white, then red again, cycling through emotions like a traffic light. How dare you? I dare because someone needs to, George said simply. I've been in this business for over 40 years. I've worked with hundreds of producers, thousands of musicians, countless people in every position you can imagine, and I've learned something important in all that time. The measure of a person isn't in what they wear or how much money they have or how loud they can shout. It's in how they treat people who can't do anything for them. It's in showing grace when someone makes a mistake. It's in understanding that everyone is fighting battles we can't see. He turned to Rose, and his expression softened. Ma'am, are you all right? Rose tried to speak, but only a sob came out. She shook her head, unable to form words, overwhelmed by everything that had happened, by the kindness of this stranger, who wasn't really a stranger at all. What's your name? George asked gently. Rose, she managed to whisper. Rose Matthews. Rose Matthews, he repeated as if committing it to memory. How long have you worked here, Rose? 17 years, she said, her voice getting slightly stronger. 17 years this November. George nodded, then turned back to Holloway. 17 years. That's longer than some marriages last. That's a career, not just a job. And you were willing to destroy that career over a few drops of wine on your fancy blazer. Does that sit right with you? Does that make you feel like a big man? Holloway looked around the table at his guests who were all carefully avoiding eye contact with him, at the other diners in the restaurant who were watching with expressions ranging from disgust to admiration for George, at Patricia, who looked like she wanted to disappear. I think maybe I overreacted, he finally said, the words sounding like they were being dragged out of him. The wine, it was expensive and... Stop, George said. Don't make excuses. Either you believe what you said about actions and consequences or you don't. Either you think it's acceptable to treat people the way you just treated Rose, or you don't. You don't get to have it both ways just because someone called you out on it. There was a long moment of silence. Rose could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could see the other servers watching from the kitchen, could see other diners in the main restaurant craning their necks to see what was happening. The entire Southern charm had ground to a halt for this confrontation. Finally, Holloway stood up. His movements were stiff, controlled, like he was barely containing his anger. I think we're done here. Get my coat, he said to no one in particular. Actually, George said, I don't think we are quite done. You owe Rose an apology. A real one. Holloway's jaw clenched. I already said I overreacted. That's not an apology, that's an excuse. An apology would be acknowledging that you treated her cruelly, that you used your position to try to hurt someone who was already struggling, and that you're sorry for causing her pain. Can you do that? The two men stared at each other for a long moment. It was a clash of two different worlds, two different value systems. Holloway represented the new Nashville, the corporate music industry, where money and connections trumped talent and integrity. George represented the old ways, the cowboy code of honor and respect, and treating people right regardless of their station. I'm sorry, Holloway finally ground out, not looking at Rose. I shouldn't have reacted that way. Look at her when you say it, George said quietly. She deserves that much. Holloway turned to Rose and she could see the resentment burning in his eyes, but he said it. I'm sorry for how I treated you. It was inappropriate. Rose nodded, not trusting her voice. The apology was hollow, forced, but it was something. It was more than she had expected to get. Now, George said, I believe you were leaving. Holloway gathered his things quickly, his expensive blazer still marked with those few drops of wine that had caused all this trouble. His guests scrambled to follow him, leaving generous amounts of cash on the table, probably hoping to distance themselves from the scene as quickly as possible. Within minutes, the entire party was gone, leaving behind half-eaten desserts and a restaurant full of people buzzing with what they had just witnessed. George turned to Patricia, who was still standing there looking shell-shocked. Ma'am, I hope this woman isn't going to face any consequences for what happened here tonight. Because if she does, I can promise you that every musician I know, and I know quite a few, will hear about how the Southern Charm treats its employees. Patricia's eyes went wide. No, no consequences, absolutely none. Rose is one of our best servers. This was just an unfortunate accident and Mr. Holloway overreacted. There will be no disciplinary action whatsoever. Good, George said. He turned back to Rose. Rose, do you have a moment to talk? Maybe over there, away from all these folks? Rose nodded, still feeling like she was in a dream. George guided her to a quiet corner of the restaurant, near the windows that looked out on Broadway's neon lights. Up close, he was shorter than she expected from seeing him on stage, but there was something about his presence that made him seem larger than life anyway. Are you really okay? He asked again, his voice soft with concern. I don't know, Rose admitted. I thought I was going to lose my job. I thought everything was falling apart. And then you came and... Her voice broke again. Hey now, George said gently. You don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone should do when they see someone being treated poorly. What you said back there about having children and one being sick, was that true? Rose nodded. My youngest, Marcus, he's 8. He has a congenital heart condition. He needs surgery and I can't... The words tumbled out before she could stop them. All the fear and desperation she had been holding inside for months. I work 2 jobs and I'm still drowning in medical bills. The surgery he needs costs $60,000 and insurance won't cover most of it. And I've been picking up every shift I can, but it's never enough. It's never going to be enough. George listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. When she finally ran out of steam, he was quiet for a moment, just looking at her with those knowing eyes that had seen a lot of life, a lot of struggle. "Rose, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to really hear me. Life has a way of testing us, of pushing us to our limits to see what we're made of. But it also has a way of providing help when we need it most, often from the most unexpected places." "I don't understand," Rose said. George smiled, that famous smile that had charmed millions of fans over decades. "You will. Now I want you to take the rest of the night off. Go home to your boys. Patricia won't object, and even if she did, I'd handle it. But before you go, I need you to give me your contact information, phone number, address, whatever you're comfortable sharing." Rose felt her heart skip. "Why?" "Because," George said, "I'd like to help if I can, and I have some ideas about how to do that. But right now you need to get home, get some rest, and stop worrying about that man and his overpriced blazer. Can you do that for me?" Rose nodded slowly, still not quite believing this was real. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and gave George her number, watching as he saved it into his own phone. Rose took the 2 buses home in a daze, barely registering the familiar route through Nashville's streets. The city lights blurred past the windows, and she kept replaying the evening in her mind, unable to fully process what had happened. George Strait had defended her. George Strait had her phone number. George Strait had said he wanted to help. It seemed impossible, like something from a movie rather than her real life. Mrs. Chen was still awake when Rose arrived, much earlier than usual. The elderly woman took one look at Rose's face and immediately pulled her into a warm embrace. "What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Rose found herself telling the whole story, the words pouring out in a rush. Mrs. Chen listened with wide eyes, occasionally gasping or shaking her head. When Rose finished, the older woman held her at arm's length and looked at her seriously. "Rose Matthews, I have known you for 6 years. I have watched you work yourself to the bone for those boys. I have seen you choose between groceries and medicine, between new shoes for yourself and school supplies for Tommy. If anyone deserves a miracle, it's you. Don't question it. Just accept it. With grace." Marcus was asleep on Mrs. Chen's couch, his small body curled around a stuffed bear that had been his constant companion since he was 3. Rose gathered him carefully, feeling his weight in her arms, hearing that slight wheeze in his breathing that never quite went away. He stirred but didn't wake as she carried him down to their apartment. Tommy was still up, doing homework at the kitchen table. He looked up when she entered, surprise evident on his face. "Mom? You're home early. Is everything okay?" Rose settled Marcus into bed, then returned to the kitchen and told Tommy everything. Her son listened with the same serious expression he wore when dealing with anything important, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "So George Strait just paid $12,000 for that guy's blazer. Just like that." "Just like that," Rose confirmed. "And he wants to help us with Marcus's surgery?" "He said he had ideas about how to help. I don't know what that means yet." Tommy leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Mom, do you know how crazy this sounds? This is like something from one of those feel-good stories you watch on YouTube." "I know. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and realize it was all a dream." "Well, if it's not a dream, then maybe things are finally starting to turn around for us. You deserve it, Mom. You deserve some good luck for once." Rose felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different tears. Not tears of humiliation or fear, but something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. She hugged her son tightly. This boy who had become such a good man, despite all the hardships they had faced. That night, Rose lay in bed, unable to sleep, staring at her phone. Part of her expected it to ring, expected George to call with whatever ideas he had mentioned, but the phone stayed silent, and eventually, exhaustion pulled her under into a dreamless sleep. The next morning started like any other. Rose got the boys ready, made breakfast with the last of their groceries, gave Marcus his medications. But everything felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight she had been carrying had lifted just slightly. Tommy noticed it too, commenting that she was humming while making eggs, something she hadn't done in months. She was dropping Marcus off at Mrs. Chen's when her phone rang. An unknown number. Her heart jumped into her throat as she answered. "Hello? Rose? This is George Strait. I hope it's not too early to call." Rose's hand trembled as she held the phone. "No, not at all. I'm surprised to hear from you so soon. Well, I'm not one to put things off when I've made up my mind about something. Rose, I spent some time last night thinking about your situation, and I'd like to meet with you today if possible. I have some things I want to discuss, and I think it would be better to do it in person. Would you be able to meet me for coffee this morning? Rose thought about her schedule. She wasn't due at the restaurant until the evening shift. Yes, I could do that. Where? George named a small coffee shop in East Nashville. Nowhere fancy. Somewhere quiet where they could talk. They agreed to meet in an hour, and Rose spent the next 45 minutes alternating between excitement and terror. What could he possibly want to discuss? What kind of help was he thinking about? She changed clothes 3 times before settling on simple jeans and a clean blouse, the nicest casual outfit she owned. The coffee shop was a local place, worn wooden tables and mismatched chairs, the smell of fresh roasted beans filling the air. George was already there when she arrived, sitting in a corner booth, his Stetson on the seat beside him. He stood when he saw her, his Texas manners showing through, and gestured for her to sit. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. "Can I get you some coffee, something to eat?" Rose wanted to say no, didn't want to seem like she was taking advantage, but George had already waved over a server and was ordering 2 coffees and a plate of pastries before she could protest. When they were alone again, he leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "Rose, I'm going to be direct with you because I don't believe in dancing around things. Last night, after I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said. About your son and the surgery he needs, about you working yourself to exhaustion trying to keep your family afloat. And it reminded me of something." He paused, and Rose saw something flicker across his face, something that looked like old pain. "My wife Norma and I, we lost our daughter Jennifer in a car accident back in '86. She was only 13 years old. It was the worst thing that ever happened to us, the kind of pain that never really goes away. But it taught me something important about life and about what really matters." Rose felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know. Not many people talk about it anymore, and that's okay. But my point is, that loss made me realize that all the success, all the #1 hits, all the awards and accolades, none of it means anything compared to family. Nothing is more important than taking care of the people we love. So when I saw you last night, fighting so hard to protect your job because you need to take care of your sick child, it struck a chord with me." The server brought their coffee, and George waited until she left before continuing. "I want to help with Marcus's surgery. I want to pay for it." Rose's coffee cup clattered against the saucer. "What? No, I couldn't possibly. Before you say no, hear me out. I'm not doing this out of pity. I'm doing it because I can, and because it's the right thing to do. I've been blessed beyond measure in my life, and with that blessing comes a responsibility to help others when I can. Your son needs this surgery, and you shouldn't have to choose between his health and keeping a roof over your head. Mr. Strait, that's $60,000. I can't accept that kind of money from a stranger." "Well, good thing I'm not a stranger anymore then," George said with a slight smile. "Rose, I understand your pride. I respect it, but sometimes pride needs to take a back seat to practicality. Would you really let your son suffer because you're too proud to accept help?" The words hit Rose like a physical blow. Would she? Could she really say no to this offer, knowing what it would mean for Marcus? She thought about his labored breathing, about the blue tinge to his lips that was getting worse, about the doctors saying they were running out of time. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll let me help. Say you'll let your son get the treatment he needs. That's all I'm asking." Rose looked at this man, this legend who could have ignored what happened last night, could have finished his meal and gone home without getting involved, but he hadn't. He had stood up for her, had defended her against someone powerful, and now he was offering to save her son's life. "Yes," she finally said, the word barely audible. "Yes, thank you. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't need to repay me, but there is something else I want to discuss with you, something that might actually benefit us both." Rose wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. "What is it?" George took a sip of his coffee, seemingly organizing his thoughts. "I'm planning a farewell tour, not retiring completely, but scaling back, doing one last big tour across the country. It's going to be extensive, probably 9 months to a year of traveling, and I need someone to help coordinate the logistics on the road, someone organized, reliable, someone who knows how to handle difficult situations and difficult people with grace." Rose's heart started beating faster. Was he suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? "I've had assistants before, and some have been good, some not so good. But last night, Watching how you handled that situation with Holloway, how you maintained your composure even under extreme stress, how you stayed professional and kind even when you were being treated terribly, I thought to myself, that's the kind of person I want working with me. Are you offering me a job? Rose asked, her voice shaking. I'm offering you a position as my personal assistant for the tour. The pay would be $85,000 for the duration of the tour, plus all expenses covered. You'd travel with the crew, help coordinate my schedule, handle correspondence, basically make sure everything runs smoothly. And here's the important part. The schedule would be flexible enough that you could bring your boys with you. We'd arrange tutoring for them on the road, and Marcus would have access to the best medical care in every city we visit. Rose couldn't breathe. $85,000. Flexible schedule. Her boys with her. Medical care for Marcus. It was too much, too good to be true. There had to be a catch. Why me? She asked. You could hire anyone. Someone with experience. Someone who's worked in the music industry. I could, George agreed. But experience in the music industry isn't what I need. I need someone honest, someone hard-working, someone who understands the value of a dollar and won't take advantage of their position. I need someone who treats everyone with respect, from the CEO to the janitor. And Rose, whether you know it or not, that's exactly who you are. I saw it last night in how you interacted with everyone in that restaurant, even the man who was humiliating you. Rose's mind was racing. This could solve everything. The medical bills, the constant financial stress, the exhaustion of working 2 jobs. She could be with her boys, could watch over Marcus during his recovery from surgery. Tommy could see the country, could have experiences he would never have otherwise. It was perfect. Too perfect. I need to think about it, she heard herself say. This is a huge decision, and I need to talk to my boys, and I need to figure out what to do about my apartment and... Of course, George said. Take all the time you need, well, within reason. The tour starts in 3 months, so I'd need to know within the next couple of weeks. But Rose, I want you to know something. This isn't charity. I'm not offering you this job because I feel sorry for you. I'm offering it because I genuinely believe you'd be excellent at it, and because I think this could be a good opportunity for both of us. They talked for another hour, George explaining what the job would entail, the cities they would visit, the logistics of traveling with children. He gave her the contact information for his tour manager, a woman named Sandra, who could answer any specific questions Rose had. By the time they parted ways, Rose's head was spinning with possibilities. She picked up Marcus from Mrs. Chen's and took him to the park, watching him play on the swings despite his limited energy. His laughter, thin and breathless, but genuine, made her heart ache. Could she really do this? Could she uproot their entire life for this opportunity? That evening she sat both boys down and told them everything. Tommy listened with growing excitement, asking questions about where they would go, what they would see. Marcus, not fully understanding the implications, was just excited about the idea of traveling on a tour bus like a rock star. But what about school? Tommy asked. What about my friends? There would be tutors on the road, Rose explained. You wouldn't fall behind, and we could come back to Nashville between tour legs. You wouldn't lose touch with your friends completely. And I could get my surgery? Marcus asked, his young voice hopeful. I could breathe better? Rose felt her eyes fill with tears again. Yes, baby. You could get your surgery. Tommy looked at his little brother, then back at his mother. Rose could see him processing, weighing the pros and cons with a maturity beyond his 15 years. Finally, he nodded. I think we should do it, Mum. This is a once-in-a-lifetime chance, and Marcus needs that surgery. We'd be stupid to say no. What about you? Rose asked. You'd be leaving everything you know. Tommy shrugged. Everything I know is watching you work yourself to death while we barely scrape by. If this chance means you get to rest a little, means Marcus gets healthy, means we get to see the country, then yeah, I'm all in. Besides, how many kids can say they toured with George Strait? Rose looked at her boys, these 2 incredible humans she had somehow managed to raise despite all the odds against them. Marcus was smiling, already imagining adventures on the road. Tommy was trying to look mature and thoughtful, but she could see the excitement in his eyes. Okay, she said. Okay, we'll do it. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Rose called George and accepted the position officially. She gave notice at the Southern Charm, and Patricia, surprisingly, was supportive, even offering to write a reference letter if needed. Word had spread about what happened with Holloway, and Rose found herself something of a minor celebrity among the staff. Several servers told her they had quit taking shifts when Holloway was scheduled, and rumor had it that he had been banned from several other establishments in Nashville after word got out about the incident. Sandra, George's tour manager, was the efficient woman in her 50s who had been working with George for 20 years. She video called with Rose 3 times, going over the details of the position, sending her schedules and itineraries, explaining the logistics of life on the road. She also connected Rose with a tutor who specialized in working with children of touring musicians and helped arrange for Marcus's surgery to be scheduled at Vanderbilt Medical Center before the tour began. The surgery was set for 6 weeks away, giving Marcus time to recover before they would need to travel. George had arranged for the best cardiac surgeon in Tennessee, and when Rose saw the name on the appointment paperwork, she had to sit down. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison was a legend in pediatric cardiology, and her waiting list was typically a year long. Somehow, George had made it happen. 2 weeks before the surgery, Rose signed the lease termination on their apartment, put most of their belongings in storage, and moved them temporarily into a small extended-stay hotel that George's team had arranged. It was surreal, packing up their life, but also liberating in a way. She was leaving behind years of struggle, years of barely surviving, and stepping into something new, something that felt impossibly like a second chance. The night before Marcus's surgery, Rose lay awake in the hotel room, listening to her boys breathe in the darkness. Tommy in one bed, Marcus in the other, both of them peaceful in sleep. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow Marcus would get the surgery that would save his life, the surgery she had been desperately trying to figure out how to afford for months. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from George, praying for Marcus tomorrow. "You've got this and he's going to be just fine. Remember, you're not alone anymore." Rose read the message 3 times, feeling something warm spread through her chest. Hope. After so long living in fear and desperation, she was finally allowing herself to feel hope. The surgery took 7 hours. Rose paced the waiting room while Tommy sat rigid in a chair, trying to be strong. Sandra came by with coffee and sandwiches, sitting with them, not saying much, just being present. And then, miraculously, Dr. Morrison emerged with a tired smile. The surgery went perfectly. Marcus did beautifully. He's going to need a few weeks of recovery, but his prognosis is excellent. In 6 months, he'll be able to run and play like any other child his age. Rose collapsed into a chair, overwhelmed with relief. Tommy was crying, not bothering to hide it. Sandra squeezed Rose's shoulder and quietly slipped away, giving them privacy for their moment of joy. Marcus's recovery was remarkable. Within 2 weeks, the blue tinge had disappeared from his lips, and he was breathing easier than Rose had seen in years. The constant wheeze that had been the soundtrack of their lives was gone, replaced by clear, strong breaths. He had more energy, more color in his cheeks, and his smile was brighter than ever. Watching him run down the hotel hallway without gasping for air brought Rose to tears more than once. During those weeks of recovery, Rose threw herself into preparing for the tour. Sandra sent her mountains of information about George's preferences, his schedule, the venues they would visit, the people she would need to coordinate with. Rose studied it all like she was preparing for the most important exam of her life, making notes, creating systems, determined to prove that George's faith in her was not misplaced. Tommy enrolled in the online tutoring program and discovered he actually enjoyed the flexibility of learning at his own pace. He had been struggling in his overcrowded public school, but with individualized attention from qualified teachers, he was thriving. He told Rose one evening that he had never felt smarter, never felt like learning could be this interesting. 3 weeks after the surgery, George invited them all to his ranch outside of San Antonio. Rose drove the rental car that the tour had provided, following GPS directions down increasingly rural roads until they reached a sprawling property with white fences and horses grazing in green pastures. It looked like something from a movie, the quintessential Texas ranch, and when George emerged from the main house to greet them, he was wearing jeans, boots, and a work shirt, looking every bit the cowboy he had always been at heart. "Welcome," he said warmly, shaking Tommy's hand and ruffling Marcus's hair. "Hope the drive wasn't too bad. Come on in, I want you to meet some folks." Inside, the house was surprisingly modest, despite its size. Comfortable furniture, family photos on the walls, nothing ostentatious or designed to impress. George's wife Norma was in the kitchen, an elegant woman with kind eyes and a welcoming smile. She hugged Rose like they were old friends. "George has told me so much about you and your boys," Norma said. "I'm so glad Marcus's surgery went well. George was worried sick the whole time, even though he tried not to show it." Over dinner, Rose got to see a different side of George Strait. Not the legend, not the king of country, but a man who loved his family, who told stories about his grandchildren, who laughed easily and listened intently when others spoke. He asked Tommy about his interests, discovered the boy loved basketball, and promised to introduce him to some players when they reached certain cities on the tour. He was patient with Marcus, who peppered him with questions about tour buses and concerts, and whether he had ever met any superheroes. After the boys had gone to explore the ranch with Norma, George and Rose sat on the back porch, watching the sun set over the Texas landscape. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air smelled of grass and horses, and something indefinably peaceful. "I never got to properly thank you," Rose said quietly, "for everything. The surgery, the job, giving us this chance. I don't have words big enough to express what it means." George was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset. "You know, after we lost Jennifer, I went through a dark time. Questioned everything. Wondered why I had been given this career, this success, if I couldn't protect my own daughter. And Norma, she was the one who helped me see it differently. She said that maybe the reason I had been blessed was so that I could help others when they needed it. That Jennifer would want us to use what we had to make a difference." He turned to look at Rose, his expression serious. "So when I tell you that helping you and your boys isn't a burden, I mean it. It's actually the opposite. It's a privilege. It reminds me why any of this matters. The music, the fame, the success. It's all just noise unless you use it to do some good in the world." "You've done more than good," Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given us our lives back. Before that night at the restaurant, I was drowning. I was working myself to death and still falling further behind. I would lie awake every night wondering if Marcus would make it to his next birthday, wondering what would happen to my boys if I collapsed from exhaustion. You didn't just help us, George. You saved us." "Well then," George said with a small smile, "I guess we saved each other. Because I was getting tired, Rose. Tired of the business side of music. Tired of dealing with people like Holloway, who care more about money than about the art. You reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people who work hard and love their families and deserve a break. So thank you for that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the Texas sky darken and stars begin to appear. Rose felt something settle inside her, something that had been restless and anxious for years. Peace. She was finally at peace. The tour launched on a warm evening in Houston, Texas. The venue was packed with thousands of fans, and Rose stood backstage with her clipboard and headset, coordinating with the sound crew and lighting team, making sure George had everything he needed. Tommy and Marcus were in the VIP section with Norma and Sandra, watching with wide eyes as the crowd roared with anticipation. When George took the stage in his signature black hat and vest, the applause was deafening. Rose watched from the wings as he launched into Amarillo by morning, his voice as smooth and powerful as ever. The crowd sang along to every word, and Rose felt chills run down her spine. This was what she was part of now. This moment, this music, this connection between an artist and his fans. The tour was everything George had promised and more. They traveled from city to city in sleek tour buses that Marcus declared were cooler than any house. Tommy made friends with some of the crew members, learning about sound equipment and stage management. Marcus's health continued to improve, and by the third month of touring, he was running around backstage with the boundless energy of a normal 8-year-old. Rose discovered she was good at her job. Very good. She anticipated problems before they arose, smoothed over conflicts with diplomacy and grace, kept George's schedule running like clockwork. She learned the rhythms of life on the road, the unique challenges of each venue, the personalities of everyone on the team. Sandra told her after 2 months that she was the best assistant George had ever had, and Rose felt pride swell in her chest. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. In Oklahoma City, they ran into Blake Holloway again. He was at the venue for some industry event, and Rose spotted him across the lobby of the hotel where they were staying. Her first instinct was to hide, to avoid any confrontation, but then she remembered she wasn't that terrified waitress anymore. She was George Strait's personal assistant, a position that commanded respect in the country music world. Holloway saw her at the same moment, and Rose watched recognition and discomfort flash across his face. He started to turn away, but George appeared at Rose's elbow, having just returned from a radio interview. "Well, well," George said mildly. "Blake Holloway. Fancy seeing you here." Holloway had no choice but to acknowledge them. "Mr. Strait, Miss Matthews, I heard you were touring together now." "Rose is my personal assistant," George said, his tone pleasant but firm. "Best hire I've made in years. Turns out treating people with respect and recognizing talent when you see it pays off. You might want to try it sometime." The barb landed exactly as intended. Holloway's face flushed, and he mumbled something about having a meeting to get to before hurrying away. Rose watched him go, feeling not triumphant exactly, but validated. She had worried for months after that night at the restaurant that she had been weak, that she should have stood up for herself better. But seeing Holloway now, seeing how small he seemed compared to George's quiet dignity, she realized she had handled it exactly right. Sometimes strength wasn't about fighting back. It was about maintaining your integrity in the face of cruelty. The tour continued through summer and into fall. They played state fairs and arenas, intimate theaters and massive amphitheaters. Rose saw parts of the country she had never imagined visiting. Tommy developed a love of photography, documenting their journey through thousands of pictures. Marcus collected souvenirs from every city, his favorite being a cowboy hat that George had given him, identical to the one George wore on stage. In Nashville, during a break in the tour schedule, Rose returned to the Southern Charm restaurant. Not to work, but to visit. Patricia greeted her warmly, and Rose was surprised to see a new policy posted prominently in the employee break room. It was titled, "The Rose Matthews Standard," and outlined a zero-tolerance policy for customer abuse of staff members. Any customer who berated or threatened an employee would be asked to leave immediately, regardless of how much money they were spending. "You started something," Patricia told her. "After what happened with Holloway and after George Strait stood up for you, other employees started speaking up about mistreatment. We realized we had been prioritizing money over our people, and that needed to change. So we changed it. And we named the policy after you because you reminded us all that dignity matters more than tips." Rose felt tears spring to her eyes. She had thought that night was the worst moment of her life, but it had turned into something meaningful, something that might protect other workers from similar abuse. Sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best changes. The tour wrapped up in December, back in Texas where it had started. The final show was in San Antonio, George's hometown, and it was a celebration unlike anything Rose had ever witnessed. Special guests appeared on stage, musicians who had been influenced by George over his 4-decade career. The crowd was electric, singing every song at the top of their lungs, and when George played "I Cross My Heart" during the encore, there wasn't a dry eye in the venue. Backstage after the show, George found Rose in the organized chaos of equipment being packed up. He pulled her aside to a quiet corner, away from the noise and bustle. "I have something to tell you," he said, and Rose felt her stomach drop. Was this it? Was the job over now that the tour was finished? "I've been thinking about what comes next," George continued. "I'm going to keep performing, just on a smaller scale. Weekend shows, select venues, nothing as intensive as this tour. But I'm going to need help managing it all. And Rose, I can't imagine doing it with anyone but you." Relief flooded through her. "You want me to stay on?" "If you're willing. Same salary, same flexibility for the boys. We'd be based out of San Antonio, so you'd have a home base instead of living on the road. And I've been talking to some people I know in the music business. Tommy has a real eye for photography, and I think he could have a career in it if he wanted. I'd like to help make that happen, pay for his education, connect him with the right people." Rose felt overwhelmed again, the way she had felt that night in the coffee shop when George had first offered her the job. "George, you've already done so much for us. And I'd like to keep doing it if you'll let me. Rose, you've become more than just an employee. You're family now. You and those boys, you matter to us. To me and Norma both. We don't want to see you go." "I don't want to go either," Rose admitted. "This year it's been the best year of our lives. Marcus is healthy, Tommy is thriving, and I'm doing work that matters, work I'm good at. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm actually living." George smiled that warm smile that had comforted millions of fans over the decades. "That's all I wanted to hear." 6 months later, Rose stood in her new living room in San Antonio, watching movers bring in the last of their furniture. It was a modest house, nothing extravagant, but it was theirs. George had helped her with the down payment, insisting it was a bonus for her excellent work during the tour. The house had 3 bedrooms, a backyard where Marcus could play, and was in a good school district for when the boys weren't being tutored on the road. Tommy had been accepted into a prestigious photography program and was already talking about maybe working in the music industry, documenting tours and recording sessions. Marcus was in a soccer league, running up and down the field with unlimited energy, his heart strong and healthy. And Rose was planning logistics for George's upcoming shows, coordinating with venues and crews, doing work she loved for someone she respected deeply. She thought about that night at the Southern Charm restaurant, less than 2 years ago, but feeling like a lifetime. She thought about the humiliation, the fear, the desperation that had consumed her entire existence. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything, and how one moment of kindness from a stranger had changed the trajectory of her entire life. Her phone buzzed with a text from George, heading to the studio tomorrow to record some new material. Want to sit in? Bring the boys if they're interested. Rose smiled and typed back her response. Yes, they would love to come. They would always love to come, to be part of this world that had welcomed them so generously. She walked into Marcus's room, where he was arranging his collection of tour souvenirs on a new shelf. The cowboy hat George had given him hung on a hook by his bed, and he wore it every chance he got. He looked up when she entered, his face bright and healthy, so different from the pale, gasping child he had been just 2 years ago. "Mom, do you think Mr. George will teach me to play guitar?" he asked hopefully. "I think if you ask him, he probably will," Rose said, sitting on the edge of his bed. "He loves teaching people about music. This is the best life ever," Marcus said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "I'm so glad that mean man was mean to you at the restaurant," Rose laughed, even though the memory still carried some pain. "Well, I wouldn't go that far, but I'm glad something good came out of it. Mr. George says that sometimes bad things happen, so that good things can happen after," Marcus continued, his 8-year-old wisdom occasionally striking profound truths. Like, if that man hadn't been mean, Mr. George wouldn't have helped us, and we wouldn't have this house, and I wouldn't have had my surgery, and we wouldn't be a family with Mr. George and Miss Norma. Rose felt tears spring to her eyes again. She seemed to cry a lot these days, but they were good tears, happy tears, the kind that came from gratitude and joy rather than desperation and fear. "You're right, baby. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best things." That evening, Rose sat on her back porch watching the Texas sunset, just as she had done at George's ranch that first time. Her boys were inside playing video games, their laughter drifting through the open windows. Her phone was full of messages from the tour crew, people who had become genuine friends. Her calendar was full of upcoming work that challenged and fulfilled her. She thought about all the people like her, people working multiple jobs and still drowning, people one emergency away from losing everything, people who were invisible to the world around them. She thought about the waitresses and dishwashers and housekeepers who served others without ever being truly seen. And she made herself a promise that she would never forget where she came from, would never forget what it felt like to be desperate and invisible. George had shown her that one person really could make a difference, that kindness wasn't just a nice idea, but a powerful force that could change lives. And Rose decided that she would try to pass that forward whenever she could, would try to see people the way George had seen her that night in the restaurant, not as invisible servants, but as human beings with stories and struggles and worth. The sun set over Texas, painting the sky in those familiar shades of orange and pink, and Rose Matthews felt something she hadn't felt in years, complete, whole, happy. Not because all her problems had disappeared, not because life was suddenly perfect, but because she had been given a second chance, and she was determined to make the most of every single day. Her phone buzzed one more time. Another text from George. "By the way, I've been writing a new song. It's about a woman who never gave up, even when things were impossible. About how the strongest people are often the ones nobody notices. About how grace under pressure is the truest form of courage. I'd love for you to hear it when it's finished. I think you'll recognize the inspiration." Rose read the message and smiled through her tears. She typed back a simple response. "I'd be honored." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening Texas sky, Rose Matthews sat on her porch and felt the weight of years of struggle finally lift from her shoulders. She had been seen. She had been valued. She had been saved by a stranger who became family. And now she had a future full of possibilities, a future she could face without fear, because she finally understood that she wasn't alone anymore. The king of country had given her more than money or a job. He had given her dignity, hope, and the knowledge that kindness still existed in the world. And that, Rose thought as she watched the first stars appear, was worth more than any amount of money could ever buy.